You know those pictures, right? World leaders, all smiles, shaking hands after signing some historic treaty. It really feels like the finish line, this big moment of triumph. But what if I told you that's actually the starting pistol for the real, much harder race? Okay, let's dive into this often overlooked world of diplomatic follow-up. And what's fascinating is that this isn't some newfangled idea. This wisdom comes to us from Francesco Guicciardini, a statesman in Florence way back in the 16th century. He knew then what we know now. A signature is just a promise. The real work, the hard part, is in the follow-through, making sure that promise on paper doesn't just unravel. So yeah, this is the million-dollar question. A more modern statesman, former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, put it even more bluntly. He basically said that the second an agreement is signed, it usually starts to collapse. And why is that? Well, because the real world is messy. Here's the core problem. States, for all sorts of reasons, might not hold up their end of the deal. Sometimes they just get distracted by other crises. Sometimes they simply don't have the capacity, the money, the tech, the expertise to actually do what they promised. And sometimes, let's be honest, they just change their minds. This is exactly why follow-up isn't just a nice-to-have, it is absolutely essential. But hey, this problem is as old as diplomacy itself. So how did our ancestors deal with it? Before we had UN inspectors and international law, the methods for making sure people kept their promises were, shall we say, a bit more direct, and often pretty brutal. The oldest trick in the book was the divine oath. You'd literally ask the gods to smite anyone who broke their word. Then things got a little more tangible. For centuries, countries would exchange hostages. We're talking the actual children of rulers as living, breathing collateral. They'd even pawn or mortgage entire towns. And finally, you had these things called treaties of guarantee, where a big, powerful country would promise to enforce a deal between two smaller ones. It's kind of wild to think that all of these methods are now totally obsolete. And if you think taking hostages sounds like something straight out of the Middle Ages, check this out. As recently as 1956, a senior Thai official secretly sent his own kids, 8-year-old Sir Chiran and 12-year-old Wai, to live in China. Why? To guarantee his government's goodwill. It's an incredible story that just goes to show how these ancient practices stuck around for a lot longer than you'd think. So, since we no longer trade royal children, how do we follow up on treaties today? Well, the modern toolkit is way more sophisticated, and the first pillar is all about monitoring. This just means having expert eyes on the ground, making sure everyone is playing by the rules. And the watchers are a really diverse bunch. You've got your national intelligence agencies using spy satellites. You've got multilateral groups like the UN, hard-hitting NGOs like Human Rights Watch, these unique hybrid organizations like the Red Cross, and of course, all the diplomats working in embassies on the ground. And believe me, monitoring can get incredibly high stakes. Just think about the UN weapons inspections in Iraq. After some really intense negotiations, inspectors were finally allowed into Saddam Hussein's super-sensitive presidential sites back in 1998. They were even accompanied by senior diplomats from all over the world just to make sure the whole thing went smoothly. We're talking a real cat-and-mouse game with global security on the line. But here's the crucial thing. No single type of monitor is perfect. International organizations like the UN have amazing technical expertise, but a country can just block their access. Independent NGOs can be really direct and hard-hitting, but their staff don't have diplomatic immunity, so they can get harassed. And embassies? Well, they're protected and on the ground, but they always have to balance monitoring with the need to keep good relations with the host country. Okay, so beyond just watching, the second modern tool is the review meeting. The best way to think of it is like a global check-in, right? It's a formal get-together where countries have to report on their progress and actually face questions from their peers. Now, these meetings usually come in two main flavors. For the big global treaties like the Climate Change Convention, you have a massive Conference of the Parties, or COP. But for agreements between just two countries, you have a smaller, more focused joint commission where they can hash things out directly. The process itself is surprisingly powerful. Let's take the Convention on Nuclear Safety, for example. First, every country has to submit a detailed report on its safety measures. Then, their peers, other countries, get to scrutinize those reports and ask tough questions. After that, they all meet to discuss what they found, and finally, the results are published. So if you don't submit a report or if your standards are slipping, you get publicly named and shamed. It's basically diplomatic peer pressure on a global scale. But what if a country isn't complying because it can't, not because it won't? And that brings us to the third, and maybe the most constructive tool in the modern diplomatic kit, capacity building. Capacity building sounds kind of technical, but it's a simple idea. It's the process of helping other countries meet their commitments. It recognizes that sometimes the biggest reason for not complying isn't bad faith, it's just a lack of resources, technology, or trained people. It's about offering a helping hand instead of just pointing a finger. And you see this in action all over the place. The Paris Agreement on climate change calls for developed nations to help developing ones with money and green tech. The International Atomic Energy Agency gives technical help to countries on nuclear safety. The UN helps train local officials on how to actually put human rights laws into practice. So here's the bottom line. Follow-up is not glamorous. It doesn't get the big headlines. It's the slow, persistent, detail-oriented work of monitoring, meeting, and helping. But it's this unglamorous work that actually turns a piece of paper signed in some fancy ceremony into real, actual progress in the world. And that really leaves us with a critical question for the future. I mean, from climate change to nuclear weapons, the challenges we face are more complex than ever. Are the tools we have, monitoring, peer review, and capacity building, are they strong enough to make sure the promises we make to each other are actually kept?